Um, Imagine you own a multi-million-dollar oil tanker.
Mhm.
The United States and Iran have just signed a ceasefire. Diplomats are taking victory photos, and the government issues a statement declaring the water is, supposedly safe for transit again.
But your marine insurance actuary sitting at a desk in London looks at the paperwork and says, I don't care about diplomatic signatures. Show me 45 days with zero explosions, or your premiums stay at war risk levels.
Which is the exact reality we are facing today. Welcome to the Claire Narescio Daily World Brief. It is Sunday, June 28th, 2026, and we are starting with a breaking situation in the Strait of Hormuz, where that June 17th ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran has completely fractured.
Yeah, the concrete facts on the ground are moving much faster than the political rhetoric. Following a drone strike on a Panama-flagged commercial vessel, the MT Kiku, the U.S. military, launched a major wave of fighter jets.
I mean, we are not talking about a limited, single-site symbolic retaliation here. The U.S. struck 10 Iranian military targets, spanning vital communication systems, regional air defense sites, and extensive drone storage facilities near the strait.
In direct, immediate retaliation, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fired multiple ballistic missiles and suicide drones at major U.S. infrastructure in the region. They specifically targeted the Ali al-Salam Air Base in Kuwait and the logistics hubs at the 5th Naval Fleet in Bahrain.
So now both nations are publicly accusing each other of violating the 14-point memorandum of understanding they just signed earlier in June. But the public consequence of this exchange is what's already locking itself into the global economy, because oil prices remain roughly 30% above pre-war levels.
Well, and that single metric cascades downward through the entire supply chain. It drives up global inflation, it raises international shipping costs exponentially, and it causes a massive spike in the price of agricultural fertilizer, which, relies heavily on natural gas for production.
I want to stop and look at the actual mechanics of that economic cascade, though. There is this prevailing narrative among some policymakers that if Washington and Tehran can just get back into a room and sign a new political peace deal, this energy crunch will just evaporate by the end of the week.
Right, but that assumption fundamentally ignores physical reality. Physical damage and engineering constraints dictate the timeline here, not political negotiations. For instance, we have to look at infrastructure like Qatar's massive Ras Laffan liquefied natural gas complex.
Which is a huge factor, because previous Iranian strikes knocked out 17% of that facility's total processing capacity. And Qatari engineers have stated that full repairs on those custom-built cryogenic components could take between 3 and 5 years.
I mean, you cannot simply flip a master switch and restart a massive refinery. Energy facilities throughout the Gulf that have been taken offline for months for security reasons have built up internal pressure and potential pipeline corrosion. They require intensive, agonizingly slow safety checks.
And, industry executives project that a full normalization of regional energy markets and shipping operations will stretch well into 2027. The insurance aspect of this is fascinating to me because maritime commercial trust does not bounce back just because a conflict pauses.
It operates a lot like a severe car crash on your driving record. Your insurance company does not care if you promise you are a safer driver now. Your premium is staying sky high until you prove it over a long period of time.
Which is why Lloyd's of London, the primary marine insurance market, has surged its war risk premiums for any vessel transiting the strait. Even if politicians declare the shipping lanes perfectly safe, actuaries demand strict observation periods, typically 30 to 45 days, with zero hostile incidents before they lower premiums.
Because a piece of paper signed in a diplomatic suite in Geneva does not, underwrite a massive oil tanker carrying millions of dollars of cargo. But statecraft operates through many different tools, and we are seeing another lever of U.S. foreign policy being deployed right now in an entirely different theater.
Moving from military power projection in the Middle East to humanitarian power in South America, where the rules of engagement are being rewritten just as quickly, we have dual earthquakes that have struck Venezuela, leaving at least 920 people dead and devastating regional infrastructure.
And the U.S. government is mobilizing a massive rapid response. They are deploying more than 250 disaster assistance response team members and pledging a $150 million assistance fund within the first 24 hours of the seismic event.
Let me pause and make sure we are contextualizing this geopolitical timeline correctly here, because the whiplash is stunning. Just 6 months ago, In January 2026, a U.S. Special Forces raid deposed the country's leader, Nicolas Maduro. Now, the U.S. is aggressively backing the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez.
When you look at how this aid actually gets delivered, you realize the entire bureaucratic game has changed. Under the current Trump administration, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, has been fundamentally dismantled as an independent entity.
I mean, thousands of career aid workers were laid off, and the core functions of international disaster assistance were moved directly under the authority of the State Department. So foreign aid is no longer framed or delivered as international charity.
It is explicitly structured as a transactional pact. By moving these operations into the State Department, disaster relief becomes a calculated instrument of bilateral diplomacy. The objective is stabilizing an interim government that the administration views as a compliant, strategic ally in the Western Hemisphere.
So changing the bureaucratic structure fundamentally alters the motivation of the aid itself. When USA operated independently, their primary metric for success was neutral human need, how many lives were saved. But housed within the State Department, the metric becomes geopolitical leverage gained.
It introduces a purely transactional model of disaster relief, which forces us to ask a rather grim question about the future of global aid. Will populations in severe distress receive American help moving forward if their local leadership does not offer a strategic return on investment?
That tension over what a government owes to vulnerable populations actually extends far beyond foreign policy. We are watching a highly consequential legal battle unfold right now regarding the federal government's obligations to its own citizens' health at home.
Yes, a federal appeals court in the D.C. Circuit just handed down a unanimous ruling rejecting an aggressive attempt by the current Trump-led Environmental Protection Agency to abandon a vital air quality rule.
The rule the court preserved restricts deadly soot pollution, specifically fine particulate matter known to scientists as PM2.5. It leaves in place a strict annual limit of 9 micrograms of fine particle pollution per cubic meter of air. And before we break down the stakes of that ruling, I will briefly mention that for more daily briefings and classic audiobooks, you can visit clarenhoratio.com.
Now, looking at the context, 25 Republican-led states, along with various heavy industry business groups, sued to block this 9 microgram standard. They argued it would drastically raise manufacturing costs and hinder industrial growth.
To understand why a 9 microgram limit matters, we have to look at the biological mechanism of PM2.5. We are talking about microscopic particles generated by coal-fired power plants, chemical factories, and diesel vehicles.
Because these particles are a fraction of the width of a human hair, they completely bypass the body's natural respiratory defenses. When inhaled, they enter the bloodstream directly and embed deeply into lung and heart tissue.
And the prior Biden-era EPA had projected that enforcing this specific limit would prevent roughly 4,500 premature deaths and 800,000 cases of severe asthma symptoms annually. So the Federal Appeals Court ruled unanimously that the current EPA's legal arguments to kill this standard completely lacked merit.
The legal paradox here is staggering to consider. We have an institution whose statutory mandate is to protect public health and the environment, spending taxpayer resources in federal court to fight for higher levels of permissible industrial pollution.
Which creates absolute chaos for regulatory stability. If fundamental environmental law fluctuates wildly based solely on who occupies the Oval Office, heavy industries cannot effectively plan long-term infrastructure investments.
And more concerningly, public health metrics simply become collateral damage in a perpetual ideological tug of war. But while the legal system debates the permissible limits of air quality, the physical atmosphere is exacting an immediate fatal toll on populations globally.
In Europe, the World Health Organization is reporting over 1,300 excess deaths linked directly to a brutal early summer heat wave. Germany has hit an all-time absolute temperature record of 41.7 degrees Celsius, which is roughly 107 degrees Fahrenheit, in the state of Brandenburg.
That marks the third consecutive day of shattered national temperature records in the country. The mechanism driving this widespread crisis is known as a heat dome, which is a persistent, stationary area of high atmospheric pressure where sinking air acts like a lid.
It traps the heat, compressing and warming the air further as it hits the ground, effectively baking the continent beneath it. I really have to challenge the media framing of these events, though, specifically the constant reflexive use of the word unprecedented.
We have to stop calling these heat waves unprecedented. When a catastrophic thermal event happens every single summer, it is no longer an anomaly, it is the new baseline.
Europe is warming at roughly twice the global average. Their infrastructure transit rails that physically warp under extreme heat and power grids that were never built to handle this thermal load was designed for a mild climate that simply does not exist anymore.
And the consequences of this shifting climate baseline are proving equally severe and lethal in the United States. Over the weekend, 3 federal firefighters were killed, and 2 were critically injured in a sudden incident while battling the Snyder Mesa fire on the remote Colorado-Utah border.
They were caught in what is known as a burnover. That occurs when a massive wildfire, fueled by extremely dry conditions and erratic winds, spreads so rapidly that it overtakes the personnel fighting it.
It cuts off all escape routes, forcing firefighters to deploy emergency foil shelter tents on the ground as the fire literally burns over top of them. The loss of those 3 firefighters is a tragic reminder of the human cost of managing public lands under these new thermal realities.
Which brings us to a major institutional shift that happened very recently in response to this crisis. Those personnel belong to the U.S. Wildland Fire Service, which was only just created in January 2026. What does the creation of a brand new federal agency tell us about how the government views the threat?
It represents a structural recognition that extreme, massive-scale wildfires are no longer seasonal, isolated emergencies. By consolidating various land management fire crews into one dedicated federal service, the government is acknowledging that these fires are a constant defining feature of the American West.
So it requires a permanent, specialized, year-round federal infrastructure to manage the threat, rather than treating it as a temporary crisis that passes when autumn arrives. But moving from the strain on physical infrastructure, there is a parallel strain happening right now within our civic and financial infrastructure.
Yes, a sweeping investigation by The Guardian into UK public contracting reveals an astonishing shift in how essential government services are funded. In the year leading up to April 2025, roughly $32.7 billion went directly to companies controlled by private equity firms.
That translates to $1 in every 11 spent by the UK government on outside contractors. The sheer breadth of this financial footprint is what makes these findings so critical, because its capital isn't isolated to one niche corporate sector.
The money is flowing heavily into the National Health Service, where private equity-backed firms are providing core pharmaceutical distributions, staffing, and direct healthcare services. It spans local city councils handling waste management, and it is deeply embedded in the transport sector.
And that includes major entities like Areva, which operates numerous vital train and bus routes across the UK, now heavily backed by U.S.-based private equity capital. To understand why policy analysts are sounding alarms over this, we have to look at the mechanics of the private equity model.
Imagine buying a house, but instead of using your own money, you use a massive loan to buy the property, and then you legally force the house itself to pay off that loan using the rent it generates. If the house can't make the payments, the house goes bankrupt, but you keep the management fees.
That is essentially the private equity playbook. A firm acquires a public service company using a significant amount of borrowed money, transfers that massive debt onto the acquired company's books, and mandates aggressive cost-cutting to maximize profit for a quick resale.
And that financial structure creates a scenario defined by conflicting motivations. When a highly leveraged for-profit entity is running an essential public service, the firm's primary fiduciary duty is to deliver returns to its investors, not to protect the public.
But if the aggressive debt structuring fails, or if the severe cost-cutting degrades the service to the point of operational collapse, the state has no choice but to step in. A sovereign government cannot allow its regional transit trains to permanently stop running, or elder care homes to abruptly evict residents.
Which introduces a massive moral hazard into the heart of public finance. Are governments essentially underwriting the risk for private equity firms? By providing guaranteed revenue streams through taxpayer-funded public contracts, the state ensures the firm gets paid regardless of the service quality.
But if the firm's leveraged financial bets go bad, they can declare bankruptcy and walk away clean, leaving the taxpayer to socialize the losses and spend billions to rebuild the broken public service from scratch.
It is the ultimate privatization of public revenue combined with the total socialization of corporate risk. And looking across the very developments we have examined today, a distinct and troubling pattern emerges regarding institutional accountability.
Whether we are analyzing the aftermath of a broken military ceasefire in the Middle East, a highly transactional model of disaster relief, a federal environmental agency fighting its own pollution mandates, or essential public services being handed to private funds, the core issue is accountability.
We are seeing the traditional mechanisms of public protection, global stability, and civic duty being systematically recalibrated to serve entirely different, often hidden incentives.
It leaves us with a critical thought to examine as these systems continue to evolve. How much of our daily civic stability relies on the quiet, unwritten assumption that the institutions providing our energy, our emergency response, and our healthcare are driven by the public interest, rather than sheer market leverage? It is fundamentally a question of who holds the safety net when the system inevitably fails. Thank you for listening to the Clara and Horatio Daily World Brief. For more of our daily briefings and classic audiobooks, visit claranoratio.m.com.